Well, greetings to friends and neighbors in Greer. This is Jon Kyl, and I come to you from my front porch, where I found there's really no better place to sit and think about the important things of the world than a front porch at Greer, Arizona. And one of those really important things is how our country came to be, which is one of the reasons that we so much enjoy celebrating 4th of July, usually together. Sorry we can't all be together this year, but through technology we can at least communicate with each other this way, and hope that next year we'll be able to see you all back at the community center when we have our Independence Day celebration together again. I thought that today I would read from what I think is the best American history book in publication. Just 3 short readings which summarize the story of the Declaration and the reasons for it, and conclude with just a little bit of an interview that was done years ago with a 95-year-old veteran. I think we may hear from another 95-year-old veteran today, and we certainly want to remember our veterans as we also celebrate their contributions to our liberty and to our great nation. We do that today as well. We won't be able to see them stand up and ring the bell, but we'll be thinking of them all on this day. So let me read from a book which is called The Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. And it is a great story. It's by Wilfred McClay. He's a history professor at the University of Oklahoma, but he has a very long and storied academic career, and is involved in a great many different activities that generally relate to the history of the United States and the history of liberty. So here are 3 readings from this history book that I think help to tell the story. He starts out by talking about John Adams and his observations about how the revolution came about. And he says in the 1770s, a profound shift of sensibility was taking place, sensibility in the colonies. As John Adams asserted, reflecting many years later on the events he had lived through, I think this was in 1814, and I'm quoting now, "The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligations. The people of America," McClay says, "were disposed to revere their king and their British institutions, but when they saw their king and all in authority under him renouncing," again quoting Adams, "the laws and constitution derived to them from the God of nature and transmitted to them by their ancestors, and behaving like tyrants, their filial affections ceased and were changed into indignation and horror. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." And McClay concludes by saying it was a revolution of the mind and the heart that they had begun. And then let's turn to the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence. Here, McClay quotes Thomas Jefferson. He says, reflecting on the matter nearly 50 years later, a year before his death in 1826, Jefferson explicitly and rightly disclaimed any great originality in his ideas. And before that, he had talked about how they had selected Jefferson to write the Declaration, that Richard Henry Lee of Virginia was the one who actually introduced the resolution in the Continental Congress, that this was on June 7th, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and then asked Jefferson to pen the Declaration. This was passed actually on July 2nd, the basic resolution, but the Declaration of Independence itself was ratified by the Continental Congress on July 4th, which is the reason we celebrate that day now. And McClay says that this declaration was in effect a press release to the world, listing the specific reasons for the American actions, but also a presentation of the key elements of a foundational American political philosophy. It was and has continued to be a document that had both practical and philosophical dimensions, and that carried both particular and universal meanings. And then he quotes Jefferson writing nearly 50 years after that. And here's what Jefferson said: "I didn't consider it any part of my charge to invent new ideas. A goal in writing the Declaration was not to find out new principles, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject and formulate an expression of the American mind that would draw authority from the harmonizing sentiments of the day." In other words, he sought to articulate the things about which nearly all Americans agreed, rather than staking out territory that might be regarded as controversial. In some of this text, he drew upon his own political writings, on those of his fellow Virginian George Mason, but the deep structure of the argument came straight out of John Locke's second treatise on civil government, particularly the idea that civil society was best understood as a contract between and among its constituent members. Accordingly, Maclay concludes here, Jefferson proclaimed it a self-evident truth that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator, not by a government or any other human authority, with certain rights including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments existed to secure these rights and derived their powers from the consent of the governed. A crisp statement of the basic principle of self-rule. When a government failed to secure those rights and failed to sustain the consent of the governed, when it evinced a design to deprive the colonists of their liberty, it was no longer a just regime, and the people had the right to abolish it and replace it, which is to say they had a right of revolution. And then the third part that I want to read from Maclay is primarily an interview that was conducted of a veteran of the battle at Concord in 1775. Maclay leads into it with this: self-rule was at the heart of it all. Self-rule had been the basis for the flourishing of these colonies. Self-rule was the basis for their revolution. Self-rule continued to be a central element in the American experiment in all the years to come. And he concludes his chapter on this by the following: "Perhaps nothing better illustrates that centrality than an interview given in 1843 by Captain Levi Preston, a soldier who fought the British at Concord in 1775, and was interviewed at the age of 91, I misspoke earlier, 91, by a young Mellon Chamberlain." And Chamberlain begins his interview this way: "Captain Preston, why did you go to Concord to fight the 19th of April, 1775? The old man bowed beneath the weight of years, raised himself upright, and turned to me and said, "Why did I go?" "Yes," I replied, "my histories told me that you men of the Revolution took up arms against intolerable oppressions." "What were they, oppressions? I didn't feel them." "Well, were you not oppressed by the Stamp Act?" "I never saw one of those stamps, and always understood that Governor Bernard put them all in Castle William. I'm certain I never paid a penny for one of them." "Well then, what about the tea tax?" "Tea tax? I never drank a drop of that stuff. The boys threw it all overboard." "Well then, I suppose you had been reading Harrington or Sidney or Locke about the eternal principles of liberty." "Never heard of them. We only read the Bible, the Catechism, Watts' Psalms and Hymns, and the Almanac." "Well then, what was the matter? What did you mean in going to fight?" "Young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this: we always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean we should." And that, concluded Chamberlain, was the ultimate philosophy of the American Revolution. And so it is. And as the song says, I'm proud to be an American because I know I'm free. And I'm proud to be part of a community that takes seriously its obligation to understand and to remember where we came from, because that's necessary in order to know where we're going in the future. We live in the greatest country in the world, and I know that all of you share my sentiment that we have an obligation to keep it that way. Very happy Independence Day to y'all.